Hello, Royal History Geeks. Gareth here. So, a few days ago, I had the awesome privilege of having a discussion with Nicola Tallis and Nathen Amin about Lady Margaret Beaufort. Nicola is Margaret's most recent biographer, recently written and published The Uncrowned Queen, looking across all of Margaret's life in some detail, and it's a fantastic read. Nathen is the founder of the Henry Tudor Society, and he has written a whole book on the Beauforts, the dynasty that effectively, over three generations, changed the course of the British Isles forever. So it was wonderful to talk with them. Um, I suspect if you're watching this, you probably know who Lady Margaret Beaufort was, but just by way of a quick overview, she was the mother of Henry VII. She was born in England in 1443 and she was on the fringes, if you like, of the Lancastrian royal family. She was in the high nobility of England. She was a wealthy heiress, which meant she had a relatively dramatic life. She was married many times. She gave birth aged 13 to her son, who became Henry VII. And during the end of the Wars of the Roses, once she saw an opportunity for him, she worked hard to help bring about the circumstances that made him King of England, helping therefore to found the legendary Tudor dynasty. Have a look at the conversation. I think you're going to really enjoy it, and I'll see you soon. Well, good evening, everybody. I say good evening. I don't know what time of day or night you're watching this, based on my analytics. Probably some of you about 2 a.m. in the morning. But good evening or good morning, everybody. We have the absolute privilege to welcome two accomplished and popular historians to be with us today on the Royal History Geeks discussion. We have Nicola Tallis, who has recently written and published an excellent biography of Margaret Beaufort, who is the subject of tonight's conversation, and Nathen Amin, who, among other things, has written a book on the whole Beaufort clan. Nicola, perhaps you could just kick off by introducing yourself and telling us how you first came across Margaret and what sparked your interest in her.
Sure. So hi everyone, I'm Dr. Nicola Tallis, and I am, as Gareth said, Margaret's most recent biographer. I first stumbled across her when I began studying for my PhD, and even though she wasn't a direct part of that, so I was looking at the jewellery collections of the Yorkist and early Tudor queens, I was given the opportunity to study some of Margaret's accounts. And it was then that it really struck me that there was a really, really good story to be told, and also perhaps another side of Margaret Beaufort to the one that we're familiar with in popular culture, maybe.
Well, I dare say we'll be picking up on that in just a moment. But Nathen, over to you.
Hello, everybody. I'm Nathen Amin, as mentioned during the introduction. I think anyone who does know me knows that the person who perhaps fascinates me the most during this period is Henry VII. For those who don't know me, I'm very Welsh, and there's certainly a bit of a man crush going on with Henry VII. What I've learnt by studying this period is that it's very difficult to kind of understand a single figure without knowing where they've come from. And I spent most of my time really focusing on the Welsh aspect and the Welsh history of Henry VII. Now, when it comes to trying to find out to discover a bit more about where Henry VII came from his maternal side, there really wasn't much out there at the time. We're going back, maybe 5 years, but nobody had written a biography of the Beauforts. So, I've almost found myself kind of researching Margaret's family and Margaret herself through my passion for Henry VII. But you can't know Henry VII without knowing Margaret Beaufort. And I'd extend, actually, you can't know Henry VIII without knowing Margaret Beaufort. And you end up just down this continuous rabbit hole where you just get lost. And that's certainly how I've personally come around to Margaret herself. But, once you're switched on with Margaret, it's very difficult to switch off, really. So here we are, I guess.
Here we are. I mean, it's an interesting point, isn't it? If we were doing this I don't know, is it a podcast maybe? If we were doing this 10 years ago, possibly even 5, but certainly 10 years ago, even a lot of history fans would have thought we were talking about a very peripheral character who there was little interest in. But it's changed since then. Margaret Beaufort is now very much front of mind for people interested in this era. And some of that, let's be honest, comes from popular fiction. And she has, whether she would welcome this or not, she has been the subject of some interesting fiction in recent years. Nicola, in terms of the Margaret that you have researched, do you recognise the Margaret you see in fictional portrayals?
I think that there's parts of her that you see in fictional portrayals that resonate. So I would say that the overwhelmingly accurate theme is Margaret's love for her son, Henry VII. And that's certainly true from the source material. We know really that I would say Henry was the great love of her life, and that, you know, from the moment of his birth, no, it's not true to say that from that time she had visions of him wearing the crown and that she believed that it was his God-ordained right. But he did become her sole primary focus, and from that time onwards, her life really revolved around him and, you know, protecting his interests and keeping him safe. And I'd say that there's also an element of truth in the portrayal of Margaret as this very pious woman. I wouldn't go as far as to say that she was a religious fanatic, because, you know, let's not forget that this was a woman who once sent a man to Buxton to deputise for her on a pilgrimage whilst she played cards. So, you know, she had her limits, but certainly religion was a very important part of her life from her childhood. So certainly that part is accurate to an extent. But yeah, the sort of notion that she was completely driven from Henry's birth to place him on the throne, it's just absolutely not true.
Well, that's an interesting point, and that's something that comes up a lot on social media. And actually, when I asked some of the Royal History Geeks community to input questions, quite a few people did raise that as a question they had. I mean, it seems to me that when Henry was born, he was so far removed from, albeit the Lancastrian royal family was still in power and he was closer to them, but he was not a realistic candidate in many people's imagination. But that said, in her girlhood, Margaret had been touted as a potential heir to the throne when the succession was unclear. Do you think that made any impression on Margaret? Was she even particularly aware of it?
No, I think Margaret was always very acutely conscious of her status and where she came from. But no, I don't really think that she ever harboured any true sort of pretensions to the throne, or indeed for Henry. I mean, you know, as you've said, when he was born, really, his birth was of no importance to anybody apart from Margaret. Nobody cared. There were far more important things going on in the country at that time. And, you know, he was seen as nothing more than the son of a nobleman, and, you know, unfortunately a nobleman who died a couple of months prior to his birth. And I think Margaret did certainly instill in Henry a sort of awareness of where he'd come from and his heritage. You know, as Nathen will say, he never shied away from the fact that he was a Beaufort and came from Beaufort origins. So I think that that's something that had come from Margaret and something that she was very, very proud of. But yeah, as far as pretensions to the throne go, I don't think there were any on her side for herself.
Nathen, you look like you want to come in there.
Yeah, I mean, what I will say is, yes, definitely correct. Henry, when he was born, was certainly just another insignificant noble mouth to feed. You know, at best, he was going to be, you know, a regional power in West Wales. That was, you know, that was his lot, really. Yeah. With regards to the idea that he was ever going to be in position for the throne, I mean, to jump completely forward, I am fairly nailed on that the earliest Henry Tudor was ever considered to be a legitimate pretender to the throne was November 1483.
Yeah, I agree.
The traditional story always goes that, obviously not the traditional story, this modern myth that Margaret's always wanted him to be in line to the throne. And even those who don't accept that go straight to this early summer of 1483. As soon as Richard III rocks up, the Tudor conspiracy is already there, ready to put him forward. Now, I find no evidence whatsoever that Henry Tudor himself was ever put forward as a claimant to the throne during that summer. I think the number one claimant that summer was always going to be Buckingham. Buckingham was Margaret Beaufort's nephew. He had a far stronger Lancastrian claim to the throne than Henry Tudor. And at that time, he was the number 2 man in the land to Richard III. You're number 2. You don't give up everything you've been given, and he was given a lot by Richard III, to then become Henry Tudor's lackey. That is an impossible situation. Now, what I have discovered is that the first time I can see anyone calling Henry Tudor a potential king of England is November the 3rd in Bodmin in, I think it's Cornwall, it might be Devon, where a group of supporters, it's Cornwall, a group of supporters on Bodmin Moor proclaim Henry Tudor the new king of England. The day before, Buckingham was executed in Salisbury. So my is Henry Tudor was always going to come across to support Buckingham's claim, which Margaret would have supported. You know, Buckingham was her nephew by marriage, and he was also of distant Beaufort blood. He had, you know, he was a duke. He had a very clear line to the throne. Buckingham's executed. Who's left standing? Very quickly, it's like, oh God, right, Henry Tudor, right, let's get Henry Tudor involved. Then, of course, a month later, there's that famous pledge in Wren Cathedral between Henry Tudor and he'll take Elizabeth of York. So this concept of always having these pretensions to that Henry Tudor would ever come to the throne, I don't even see it existing until after Richard's become king, after the princes have disappeared, after Buckingham's been murdered. You know, it completely flips this myth on the head that she always had this idea. That's how I read it anyway.
That's fascinating. Did Margaret maybe herself contribute a bit to this myth? I'm just thinking, of course, that famous story, which I believe is a Tudor era story, of her sort of bumping into Buckingham on the road and saying, "Oh, hang on a minute, have you thought about my son? He's a bit more in line than you, surely." You know, and Buckingham said, "Oh, yeah, of course, that's what a great idea." I'm paraphrasing somewhat. Did some of that come later to sort of justify that everyone sort of always saw the Tudors as a potential?
Yeah, I mean, why not? We know, for example, you know, Matt Lewis, the Ricardian author, a very good concept of how Thomas Stanley has later inserted himself, almost backported himself into the Tudor origin story to give himself a far bigger part to play than he did.
Yeah.
We have Bernard Andre clearly creating this story that as a child, Henry Tudor was put before Henry VI, who prophesied he would become the king. I think there was an element of them rewriting their own stories a little bit.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be this kind of like devious propaganda, people think. It's just sometimes I forget sometimes the part I've already played 15 years ago in my own life, and, you know, certain things I've done in my life. When you're telling a story with your friends, you get sometimes these little, details incorrect. So it doesn't have to necessarily have been some sort of like evil rewriting of history. It could have been Margaret, 15 years down the line, believed that she had convinced Buckingham to change the line and so on. But yeah.
That's an interesting point about how people understand their own history, and you're right, it does change as you get older. I mean, Nicola, thinking back to Margaret, of course, famously told Fisher that she had a vision persuading her to marry Edmund Tudor when the situation presented itself, which of course many have interpreted as a young girl's way of trying to reconcile what, albeit to use 21st century language, must have been a pretty traumatic experience for a girl that age. Would that be your way of making sense of how Margaret made sense of her surroundings?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think she had the benefit of hindsight on her side at that time, and so yeah, it's this whole concept of making your own history. And I think that at that time, you know, it suited her interests at that time to sort of portray her marriage to Edmund as the union that had led to the creation of the first Tudor king. So I think yeah, it was sort of, I think she kind of played on that and really heightened that with, you know, the benefit of knowing what came after and what followed and what the result was, for sure. I think I was just going to say as well that Nathan's point about November 1483 is actually really interesting, because my perception has always been, because, you know, we are quite often asked about when Margaret thought that Henry had a chance at the throne, and my perception has always been that it was perhaps slightly earlier than that. I'm not 100% convinced that she would have backed Buckingham's claim, because my hunch is that she saw this opportunity, noticing how unpopular Richard III was and his rule was, and, you know, espied this as an opportunity whereby her son, you know, could potentially return home to her. But I think that's really interesting, what Nathan said.
I think the common,
come on then.
yeah, I think the common belief there is that we see Margaret definitely as being a reactive force. You know, she's reacting.
Yeah.
Richard's done what Richard's alleged to have done, and rather than being this kind of this force that's coming through from 20 years, you know, pushing her way to the top, you know, she's just acting to what the hell is going on around her.
Absolutely.
Now, yeah, I guess, yeah, the golden question is always going to be, when did this start, you know? But whenever it started, at the end of the day, she's reacting to what's around her. You know, exploiting the situation that's not of her making. I think that's the key thing with understanding Margaret Beaufort. She didn't make this situation. She just did it.
Well, and I think her activities throughout the 1470s are not the activities of somebody that's campaigning for her son to become king. They're the activities of somebody hoping for her son to be reconciled to what is the new regime.
Absolutely. And you think about it, how dangerous is this? What a huge risk is she taking? You know, when obviously, like you say, she had been trying so hard to reconcile Henry VII, he wasn't Henry VII then, Henry Tudor to the Yorkist regime, and she had been petitioning Edward IV for a pardon for him, and he had gone as far as to draft that pardon, and then suddenly it's kind of like a soap opera, isn't it? He dies before the pardon could be signed, and then everything's kind of thwarted for her, and it's all up in the air. But it's a huge risk for her, I think. You know, and it's quite interesting. I quite often wonder what her mindset must have been from 1 minute she wants to reconcile with Edward IV, and then suddenly the tumultuous events that see the princes in the tower disappear and Richard establish himself as king just throw everything to pot.
But even later than that, I mean, she met and sat with Richard III after he became king. She organised a meeting with him. You know, we don't know the full details of exactly what transpired, but she's come out of that meeting, and very shortly after that, she's conspiring. Did she then ask Richard, "Are you going to bring my boy back?" No way. You know, I'm not having Tudor back, because she's gone. There's nothing to lose here. There's absolutely nothing to lose. Because I feel that as almost Henry Tudor's entire mentality around this period was almost tough. Let's just, you know, I've lived my life in exile for so long. I've got nothing with me. It's almost like a kamikaze, you know, mentality. Like, let's just go for it. And I think maybe she got that meeting, and she then fueled Henry's own mind by going, look, Richard's not having you back. We've tried so long with Edward. He's gone and died.
Yeah.
Let's just go for it. You know, something happened at Richard III meeting, I think, that completely switched her mentality.
Yeah, I agree. Totally agree.
Fast forwarding a little bit into Henry's actual kingship, another stereotype of Margaret, and this comes both from people who love her and from people that hate her, is that, forget about Henry. Margaret was in charge, really. She was always whispering in his ear, and she was the Queen of England, really. I mean, Nathan, does that really fit any understanding of Henry's kingship whatsoever?
I mean, me and Nicola might have different ideas. I'm not sure because obviously Nicola studied Margaret herself far more than I have. I study things from Henry's view.
Yes.
Yeah.
From my reading, from Henry's viewpoint, from Henry's shoes, I don't see any real support for this idea that Margaret was the true power behind the throne. Margaret was the true, the queen in anything other than the name. She was puppeting Henry. I don't see that. And the reason I don't see that is because Henry had been powerless for his entire 28 years. He had always lived on other people's whims. He's now king, and he never shared that power with anyone. Henry is one of the most, one of the kings who really retained as much power as he could for himself. Now, I do not doubt whatsoever that Margaret Beaufort would have been an influence per se, but I see it as a very soft influence on par with Henry's inner circle. So, men like Reginald Bray, men like Thomas Lovell, Giles Daubeny, Henry had his close circle. And I'm sure Margaret would have spoken to him about things. They would have spoken things. But Henry was certainly his own man. Henry was certainly his own leader. And he always went his way. So I don't see Margaret as this, again, soft influence, not the influence, certainly not ruling the kingdom through him. I think this does come, a lot of this mentality comes down to July 1498. Now, in July 1498, Henry had Spanish ambassadors at his court. There was a lot of, several years of diplomatic missions between Spain, Scotland, and England. The marriage of Catherine of Aragon and so on. The English-Scottish wars. In that month, Pedro de Ala, a Spanish ambassador, but a Spanish ambassador to Scotland, with sympathies to Scotland, was in England trying to broker peace between England and Scotland. And it was he who wrote home, having only been in England for 2 weeks, that the king is much influenced by his mother. And then he said something like, the Queen doesn't like it. That quote has just come straight down to us since then. There's no context to the quote. There's no wide understanding of who was Pedro de Ala, in England and so on. He just could very conceivably just rocked up in England for 2 weeks, seen Margaret speak to her son, seen Elizabeth of York perhaps, for wherever you just have an off day, and it created this enduring image of the woman behind the throne, the wife who hates him, Henry in the middle, weak. Henry Tudor was one of the most personally strong kings that's ever ruled this country in terms of his own mind, his own idea, his own strategy. Yeah, Margaret Beaufort, a soft influence, nothing. I don't think it was anything out of the ordinary. No different to Cecily Neville, perhaps helped to Edward IV and so on.
Yes. Now, Nicola, your biography of Margaret is called Uncrowned Queen. Where did that? How does that? Obviously, I've read the book as well. What was as you were having discussions about the names of the book? What were you hoping to capture in that title?
I think so. Just to say, as boring as it sounds, I actually completely agree with everything Nathan's just said. But and that sort of quite neatly brings me on to the title of the book, because when I refer to her as the uncrowned queen, I'm not trying to say that she was more powerful than Henry VII, because Nathan's quite right, but it's more the fact that in the context of female authority and females at that time, Margaret was an unprecedented power, and had more, arguably, well, I think more influence and more power than Elizabeth of York. So I think what I was really trying to allude to was the fact that, yes, suddenly, from nowhere, her son wins the Battle of Bosworth, becomes Henry VII, and Margaret's whole life and her position are completely transformed. And she does wield influence, and she does later wield power, because let's not forget Henry VII does appoint her as his sort of unofficial lieutenant in the Midlands. So it's really trying to capture the essence that this was a woman who had a great deal of power within her own sphere and was pretty much a queen in all but name.
And of course and although it doesn't seem like details of this are hugely clear, it looks like she played some kind of unofficial regency role in the first weeks of Henry VIII's reign as well.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, as you say, it was an unofficial role, but it wouldn't surprise me, maybe Nathan's got a view on this, but whether Henry VII had left some kind of oral instruction to his mother to make sure that his son was guided in the right direction, because we know, of course, that Henry VII was keeping his son on a bit of a tight rein in the later years of his reign. So I think Henry VII always had a great belief and great trust in Margaret's abilities and trusted her judgment, and I think he probably would have recognised or believed that he could entrust her with this task. And there is certainly evidence of Margaret attending council meetings and basically trying to ensure that the succession of her grandson is a smooth one.
Yeah, I mean, Henry VII appointed her as, made Margaret, his executor of the will. So but a very clear role to look after life after me.
Yeah.
But just even being very reductive or bringing things really into the most simplest terms. The one thing that I really struggle to understand with this modern reading of Margaret Beaufort is, why is it so bad, so horrifying that she loved her son and that she was around him when he came back into her life to the end? I mean, what is so bad about being a good mother and close to your son? That's something we would all aspire for in today's age. I know we can't put today in back then, but why is this so difficult for some people to grasp? They would just close. Why wouldn't you take advice from your mother? Again, you don't. I would do it today. I'd ring my mother. I would take some advice of it. Doesn't mean I follow the advice. Why?
I'm sure you do, because she might be watching.
Depends what I'm asking. But why is it so difficult for us to view Margaret and Henry's relationship as a positive thing rather than this negative reading recently has become?
Yeah.
But there we go.
No, it's so true, because it's perfectly understandable, isn't it? Because she hadn't been with him for the majority of his life. She hadn't seen him for nearly 15 years by the time that he, Bosworth comes around. So perfectly understandable that she wants to spend time with him. And you're so right. Everyone seems to find it abhorrent, but it seems natural to me.
What's actually fascinating is how close they were able to become when they barely had no physical relationship for almost the entire of Henry's life. Because not only that, take away the 14 years he's gone, he was with the Herberts for 10 years before that. With Pembroke. Margaret wasn't, she visited him occasionally, but she wasn't on the ground in person. And it's that's what I find astonishing, is this bond they built.
Yeah. I put a lot of that down to, I don't know what you think about this, but I've sort of put a lot of that down to the fact that Henry recognised how much Margaret had sacrificed for him, and how much he recognised her efforts to keep him safe and to protect him, really, and all of the hard work that she'd put into trying to reconcile herself with the House of York in order to bring him home safely. And I think I think none of that was really lost on him. But like you say, it's really extraordinary, considering that they didn't really have any kind of physical relationship, not very much at all.
I wonder if it is the strength of that relationship which leads on to the second negative impression of Margaret, because as well as having the very extreme Margaret was evil, child killer, all the rest of it, and we'll no doubt we'll touch on that, there's another negative impression of Margaret, which is not as severe, but is more around the domineering mother-in-law from hell, a particular sense that she marginalised the role of Elizabeth of York. And I wonder if it's that closeness to Henry that partly contributes to that perception.
Potentially, but to be honest, I think it's nonsense. And it all stems down to what Nathen was saying earlier about the comments of the Spanish ambassador. And yeah, it has sort of unfortunately filtered down to Margaret's detriment and provided great material for Margaret as being the mother-in-law from hell. But actually, all of the contemporary evidence paints a very different picture and suggests that actually mother-in-law and daughter-in-law got along quite well, and certainly worked for the best interests of their families. And I think also, I think that, as Nathen also was saying earlier, really, I mean, it's only natural that Margaret may have got on Elizabeth's nerves from time to time. Anybody living in close proximity, it's bound to happen, isn't it? But it may just be that, he'd caught them on an off day. And unfortunately for Margaret, that off day happened to be one that was recorded and passed down. But I think if there really was any kind of true malice and discontent between the two, I think there'd be more evidence of it, and more people would have recorded it and noticed it at court. And so I think the fact that there is just that one reference is quite telling, really.
Absolutely. And just to add to that, Margaret had known Elizabeth since she was a little girl. Margaret didn't just come on the scene when Henry came back. She had known Elizabeth almost Elizabeth's entire life. That's a 2-decade relationship. And there's going to be ebbs and flows. There's going to be times where they're going to can't stand the sight of each other. Other days they are absolutely getting on. They work together against Henry to stop the Princess Margaret Tudor from going to Scotland. Why isn't that made more of? If you want to use one piece of evidence to try and portray a negative image, well, let's use one piece of evidence to a positive image. Things are far more complex than that, but that's what people are doing. And it's just, I mean, you're right. I think that people are taking this one piece of evidence and just running with it.
Well, talking of claims that are made without much evidence, we have to address this point, although we don't need to spend long on it. The prince is in the Tower. What's going on with that? Is there any possibility, any piece of evidence that could point toward Margaret being in any way involved in their disappearance, shall we say?
No.
No answer. The only thing I'm willing to concede with the Margaret Beaufort situation is that if somebody wants to put Margaret Beaufort in the mix, if they want to say she has the means, the motive, the opportunity, whatever, in the mix to kill a princess, I will accept that, but you always have to put Richard III above her. You cannot in any circumstance have Margaret Beaufort as a suspect in the Princess in the Tower and not have Richard III. It's impossible. It's the most impractical kind of gibberish I've ever come across. So I'm saying, put Margaret Beaufort in the mix, but do not tell me Richard III didn't have more means, more opportunity, more, motive.
But he hasn't got the face of a tyrant, though. He was just a loving uncle. You can't blame Richard. Do you know what I think the really, really frustrating thing that I find is that, if you criticise Richard III, you get told off for it. But it's fine to criticise Margaret. It's fine to say she's the devil. And, and I think that's so unfair, whether you love Margaret or you loathe her. Surely they have to be treated with the same kind of, they have to be afforded the same kind of treatment. And you just can't do that.
What I will say, the one key frustrating defence of Richard III I always hear is it doesn't fit Richard III's character to have killed the Princess. Okay, well, let's accept that. Why does it fit Margaret Beaufort's character on what we know of her. That she would suddenly randomly kill 2 boys when every single reading, anecdotal evidence, sourced evidence of her she's not a child killer. It's just. No.
I've actually heard it said, well, if she could lie about having a vision, she could lie about killing the princes.
Oh, goodness.
That's the train of thought, people. But it's very hard to convince somebody who has convinced themselves not to be convinced, isn't it?
Yeah. So I mean, the only thing I'll just stick to my original point is that I cannot say Margaret Beaufort didn't kill the princes. I don't have the evidence. I can't say that for fact. But if you people are going to say it, please put Richard III above Margaret, and then we can have the discussion. But people don't want to go there, so.
No. I think the only thing I will say is that having studied Margaret's accounts, and she was a hugely religious woman, as we've kind of touched on, and there are numerous references to, making offerings, similar things that you find in Henry's chamber books, but sort of on in greater volume, I guess. And there's nothing there that, I mean, you would think that if this woman had committed this atrocious crime, that she'd be paying and doing some kind of penance for the rest of her life or something like that. But there's nothing at all in her accounts that suggests or links her with it in any way. And that's not conclusive evidence, I accept that, but I do think it's also quite telling, given that she's quite a religious woman.
Nicola, we've talked quite a lot about both about how Margaret was seen by contemporaries and how she's been seen more recently. How have historians over the era dealt with Margaret?
I think she's been quite largely overlooked, actually, and I think it's fair to say that she has pretty much been treated as a bit of a footnote. People kind of dismiss her as, oh, that's Henry VII's mother, and then don't really say that much more about her until, I have to say, the wonderful Mike Jones and Malcolm Underwood created their wonderful study of Margaret, and I think that sort of went some way to bringing Margaret back into the picture, and sort of paved the way for people like me to come along and tell her story, I guess. But I think she has often been sort of dismissed, or just given a bit of a one-liner, and nobody really has any particularly strong opinions about her. Or they tend to say that I've forgotten who it was now. It was a biographer of Henry's that said that she was Henry's domineering mother, and so again, that's this sort of image of her that's persisted, I think. But
I will tell you a piece of, it's just anecdotal evidence, but I gave a talk for the Richard III Society a couple of years ago, and a woman came up to you.
Man.
Yeah, they're always lovely when you catch them in person. You just need to smile a lot, and but she's just one woman. I appreciate that, and it's just one woman's views. But what she said has stuck with me, because she told me, because I was getting, people telling me how much they hate Margaret Beaufort, left, right, and centre, and she's quite elderly, over 80 and so on. And she said she had been a member of the Richard III Society 40 years, and she had never heard Margaret Beaufort mentioned as a possible candidate for murdering the Prince in the Tower, or even Margaret Beaufort mentioned negatively or at all until the last 10 years. Which
really?
All of a sudden, like, as you say, she's just been ripped from history and put straight into this this fire almost, of the evil, domineering, horrible mother-in-law. And I think you're right. I didn't really think that she had been ignored or overlooked. And that's precisely what she has done. I mean, this will obviously go back to a lot of histories written by men. They've paid her no heed. And I think it's very good, very interesting that we can now get female historians bring in her story. And it's about time that's happening, because she has been ignored. And she doesn't deserve it. She should be one of the most lauded figures in British history, in my opinion, which I guess we'll come to later. We'll discuss her legacy and so on. But yeah, I think she has been overlooked. I think that's something I hadn't. But she certainly has not been you don't go back and find these texts in the 1940s, 1950s, 1980s talking about Margaret Beaufort, the killer of the Princess of the Tower. It doesn't. No. The entire academic argument isn't there.
Mm. There's the George Buck reference, isn't there, which is slightly obscure and odd.
And and he was a fraud, you know. He's not a credible source whatsoever. If we're dismissing Shakespeare, who wrote 50 years before George Buck, then we can dismiss George Buck. I think that's a very fair argument. But
yeah, I just think, I don't even if Margaret had motive, I personally don't think she had opportunity as far as the princes go. Well, that's if we're okay, actually we won't get into that whole argument, but
if we're assuming a 1483 death, then yes.
Yeah, which I think happened.
so do I. I mean, one of the things I've often wondered is there's this great Victorian biography of Margaret. And I can't remember the name of the lady who wrote it.
Domvile?
It might well be. And it was written in 1837 to commemorate Queen Victoria coming to the throne, and let's look at some other really important women from history. And she just spends pages and pages explaining away Margaret's vision, because of course Protestant England doesn't know what to do with all this sort of high churchy Catholic stuff. And I just wonder whether, I mean, assuming England, this is an oversimplification, I know, but England's pretty solidly Protestant by sort of the late 1500s. And I just wonder in part, do they know what to do with someone who was so explicitly Catholic all the time as Margaret, who talked about visions and things, and whether that's partly why historians are, let's just leave that one out.
Yeah, I mean that's quite an interesting theory. I don't know.
That's outside my knowledge zone too much, but it makes perfect sense why they would overlook, you know, such a famous and apparently ardent Catholic. It makes perfect sense to me.
And I'm not sure it even have been as conscious as that. It's just I just always was so struck by that Victorian biography, which took so long, both to explain the fact she came from an illegitimate line, which was pretty scandalous, and the fact that she'd had a vision, which was just sort of anathema to whoever this obviously very good Church of England writer was. Coming back then to the Margaret that we find in historical sources, what do you think, Nicola, let's start with you again, what do you think her best qualities were?
I think her generosity was certainly right up there, and not just to her family, about who she cared very deeply. I think, you know, her family were her main priority in life, but also to her friends, to her servants, and to the poor as well. I mean, we find her paying the debts of a priest who was in jail. We find her giving alms regularly to the poor. Her household absolutely adored her, and you couldn't speak highly enough of her. And she had, at her palace of Collyweston in the Midlands, she took children into her chapel. There's quite frequent references in her accounts to the children of the chapel, who were all clothed, fed and educated at her own expense. So I think that she was somebody who was extremely wealthy, but who was able to use her wealth not only for her own benefit and that of her family, but also to aid those who were less fortunate. So I think that's, you know, part of that is, of course, an expected quality for women in that time. You know, charity is expected, but I think that actually she went above and beyond, and I think that it was something that was very personal to her. And again, we sort of see this when she founded the two Cambridge colleges, Christ's, which was founded during her lifetime, and St John's, which was founded 2 years after her death. And I think that was probably done with the view that she had received a decent education, but hadn't been as well educated as she had hoped. And I think she was eager to use her wealth to ensure that others were given the opportunity to receive an education, which I think says a great deal about her as a person. So yeah, definitely her thoughtfulness and her generosity.
I mean, just on top of the two obviously famous Cambridge institutions, she also founded, I think, a free school for general students in Wimborne, which her parents are buried. That is, that's a conscientious woman who's, everything you've just said, wanted other people to get an education. Yeah. I mean, the one with Margaret Beaufort, what I find interesting is this idea, going back to a bit of modern naysayers of her. Now, many of those modern naysayers, which is a polite way of saying Ricardians.
Thought you were going to use another word then.
Yeah, no. I've learned my lessons. What's interesting is many of these people are the first types of people to really round on Henry VIII for executing Bishop John Fisher. How you've done this to such a wonderful Catholic saint, and I agree. So if you are saying that you really respect and trust this man, Bishop John Fisher, then surely we have to trust and respect his judgment of Margaret Beaufort, which I will always say, if you ever want to know Margaret Beaufort, you ever want to understand the type of woman she was, just go to Bishop Fisher's funeral array. Just listen to how how generous she was, how kind she was, how gentle she was, how she always forgave and forget any wrongs done to her. He's portraying this woman who is almost like this lovely little grandmother that we all have. Just this timid little woman with a heart of gold and a strong will to make the world around better. And I know that sounds like we're really kind of going to town on how great she was and so on. But this is the source evidence we have. There were people after her death who were talking her up. I think there's a guy, Edward Lineker, one of her men, who mentioned how great she was as a benefactor. Bishop John Fisher again wrote letters years after her death to Bishop Fox talking about how he himself had learned more from Margaret Beaufort when she took him on to be her churchman. This woman must have been an incredible patron to have around.
Is there a chance that those of us, and I think all three of us would be in this category, that really admire Margaret, perhaps because we see so much negativity about her, that we overreact and ignore some of her negative qualities? I'm just thinking about, of course, that Fisher saying how generous she was and she forgave all wrongs. But of course, one of the things that comes out in the Jones and Underwood study is she was quite vociferous about pursuing what was owed to her or any land she thought she was. Now, that's partly that's the era of the day. That's how people did business. Yeah. But are we at risk, Nicola, of forgetting about some of her less desirable qualities?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to try and look at it objectively, and it will come across that I am a massive Margaret Beaufort fan and admirer, which I am, but I hasten to add that is after studying the sources for her life. I haven't just sort of jumped on the Margaret bandwagon, and so I think it is important to remember that yes, she wasn't perfect by any means. She was human, and she made mistakes. She did have bad qualities. She could be quite grasping, and she did have a dogged determination to pursue what she believed was rightfully hers. And she was like a dog with a bone who just wouldn't let it go. And we see that with this debt that she'd inherited, which had from the Duke of Angoulême, when he had been kept as a prisoner during the 100 Years' War, and she's desperately trying to pursue this debt, but not necessarily for her own interest, but for the benefit of Henry VII, her son. And eventually she sort of passes this claim over to him. But yes, there's certainly a side of her that I don't think you'd want to mess with her necessarily. Like, I think she could be your best friend, but she could also really get on your nerves if you got on the wrong side of her, or if, God forbid, you owed her any money.
Well, speaking about getting on the wrong side of her, one thing that people will not forgive me if I don't ask is her relationship with Elizabeth Woodville. I think we probably all know which TV programmes have caused people to be so interested in that. But obviously, one time they were collaborators. Did they have a rift? We don't really know. What do you both of you make to their relationship?
Do you want to go first, Nick?
Yeah, I mean, I just don't think there's too much evidence to base much on. I mean,
yeah,
anything I say here is just going to be complete assumptions, almost pulled out of the sky, because there isn't these, letters from the pair. There isn't these interactions between the pair. They were very rarely around each other after 1485. I mean, that didn't cross much. So it's all speculative, and I don't know whether that's positive or negative, to be honest.
It is a really tricky one. I think I get asked about this quite a lot, and as you say, Nathan, there's not anything really to base our thoughts on. I think that there's nothing to suggest that prior to 1485 that they didn't get on, 1483, that they didn't get on particularly well, because I think obviously Margaret was attending Edward IV's court, and we know that she carried Princess Bridget, the youngest of the Queen's children, to the font at her christening in 1480. That doesn't necessarily indicate that Elizabeth liked her or trusted her. That doesn't tell us anything really, other than that she was given this honour. So it is really difficult. There has been speculation that Margaret was involved in Elizabeth's removal from court, but again, we don't know. We've got no idea if that's accurate or not. I don't know, this could be wrong, but I suspect that had more to do with Henry not wanting to finance the lifestyle of Elizabeth of York, contributing towards his mother and Elizabeth Woodville as well, rather than Margaret sort of having a word. But I don't know.
I would even add there, a third option that never seems to be thrown in the mix is whether Elizabeth Woodville voluntarily departed court to go to Bermondsey, whether she was sick. She realised that she no longer has a role herself to play. Her son is Thomas Gray's being suspected of being involved in Lambert Simnel plots.
Yeah.
There's nothing to suggest that Elizabeth Woodville in 1487 willingly just went, my time here is done, I'm going to Bermondsey. Because 2 years later, she rocked back up at the birth of Margaret Tudor. So she certainly wasn't persona non grata. She was still allowed to come back. So, yeah, there's not enough evidence to there's certainly not enough to base an entire TV series and a fiction series around, and then use that as actual factual evidence to overwhelm me every day on the internet with it doesn't exist.
It's the relationship that everybody wants to know about, but that unfortunately we don't know about.
Oh, that's a very honest answer from you both. Well, believe it or not, our time is sharply drawing to a close, but perhaps I could just we could end by me asking both of you to say if you had to describe what you thought Margaret's biggest legacy to the world was, what do you think it is? I don't mind who wants to go first. Nicola, you go first.
Oh, sorry,
No, you go first.
That's the thing. I think it's the fact that she was the foundress of England's most famous and notorious dynasty, but not necessarily acknowledged as such. But I think it's important that we do start acknowledging her as such. And I think that we could put her on a par with Elizabeth. It's just that she hasn't been given the same attention and the same limelight as Elizabeth. So, yeah, in my view, it is her role in founding the Tudor dynasty.
Wonderful. Nathan?
I mean, we obviously, all of us, build on the progression made by generations before us. And for all of the criticism that gets thrown at the Tudors, especially Henry VIII for being this great destroyer of buildings and etc. Henry VIII and Henry Tudor built on Margaret Beaufort's legacy. And even in a smaller scale, such as how she was a conscientious, patron of the arts. She supported the book trade just starting. People that she sponsored, the churches, the schools. Those ideas that would have been inherited by Henry VII and Henry VIII and so on.
Yeah.
And even though they may not be these kind of in-your-face legacies, just those ideas, and the country's moving step by step forward. And I think that was her legacy, again, on a smaller, more personal scale. Her descendants are following her example.
Nicola, Nathen, thank you so much for joining us. It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation. Thank you.
Oh, pleasure. Thank you.